Today we're going to look at fiscal policy. Don't worry, everything is going to be under control. This video will cover the fiscal policy for the federal government. It will explain various tools from leading and lagging indicators to trade embargoes. It will also cover ways how the government will or can spend your hard-earned tax dollars. Every administration plans their fiscal policy around different indicators. They use indicators to plan when to spend, when to save, and when to take on certain projects. It's kind of the report card of the federal government, how the economy as an entire nation is doing. So naturally, gross domestic product, GDP, employment numbers, inflation, interest rates, budget deficits, fiscal policy, monetary policy, business cycles, sector rotations, leading, lagging indicators, and so on, all plays a huge role in fiscal policies. The President of the United States and the Treasury Secretary will always go out in front of the press and talk about how are we doing as a nation, how is the economy going on. When it comes to leading indicators, not only is the stock market a great indicator, but also like money supply, index of consumer expectations, interest rates, average hourly worked by manufacturing and stuff like that. You also have like payrolls that is kind of reporting it, week by week, bi-weekly and so on. And those numbers are important to compare how things are going as well. Other lagging indicators are typically ratios that looks backwards and see where we went from and where we are today, and we can compare those numbers and where we're going down the future. The question is, should the federal government be active or passive in their decisions? Some ideas is maybe, should we go to war or should we work for peace? And from the point of view of the United States, winning a war is not the problem. It's all the anarchy and lack of security when it comes to a collapsed nation state, just like Afghanistan or Iraq. The collapse of society after the war is typically the problem, not the war itself. And that's why international trade is a beneficial way of ensuring peace. However, if there's a rogue organization out there, or I would say country, then certain sanctions might be in order. And that could be a trade embargo. Another active or passive idea would be, should we get refugees to come to us? But the problem is only the strong and typically the wealthy has the ability to come and, as a refugee to us. Or should we help them in place? Should we talk to the United Nations and say, hey, we should go into this country like Syria and put up hospitals and put in a safe zone for refugees to stay? Other parts of fiscal policy might be consumption. After all, the government is the biggest consumer of goods and services in any given nation state. So they're a huge part of international trade. They might, encourage globalization, and it encourages prosperity for all. So where's a good place to find all this exciting information? Well, I always recommend everyone to have a copy of The Economist. Not only do you get a really good, well-written magazine that's written by typically professors and highly educated individuals, and it will come out once a week, and means that they have a full week to kind of get that article in. And not only that, it comes with a beautiful app. You can have it in your phone, and it's so awesome because they have this cool person in England that is reading the news for you. You could just listen to it. It's fantastic. The Economist also have lots of good data that has, all the indicators that you possibly might need to better understand what's happening out there in the world. A great way of understanding where we are is to listen to presidential addresses, such as the State of the Union or a farewell address, like the one from Bill Clinton. So when Bill Clinton said adios on January 18th, 2001, he had three main parts that he wanted to inform the United States about. One was maintaining some sort of fiscal responsibility. And if we did that, and he had this idea that if you pay as you go, which means that you have to earmark every spending with a tax or some sort of revenue. Another part was that he wanted to promote more global freedom, and another part was there was a huge threat of terrorism, drugs, and trafficking that will cause major problems going forward. And then he wanted to remind everyone that we, as Americans, we're a coat of many colors. We have people we're a melting pot, people from all over the place, and we need to continue to create equal opportunities for all of us. Now, here's the problem. Congress has a spending problem. And to illustrate that, going back several years, back to Jimmy Carter when he was president in the 70s, he had $1 trillion national debt. He was struggling with inflation. President Ronald Reagan left office with $2.6 trillion, and they had a major issue where they were trying to end the war, the Cold War, against the Soviet Union. And Star Wars was really pushing the technology on missiles and stuff like that. George Bush Sr., he left office with $4.5 trillion in national debt. He had two problems. One, he had Desert Storm, where Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and there was a recession, so that cost a lot of money. President Bill Clinton, he left office with $6 trillion in national debt. In the beginning, his spending increased, but as he was getting everything in order, and he had the very strong benefit of the dot-com expansion, that we were, really doing really good in the economy, and that meant that he had really strong revenues in form of taxes that helped pay down a lot of the national debt that we had, and he had a couple smaller conflicts, but overall it was not all bad. It was a fairly good time. President George W. Bush, he left office with about $10 trillion in national debt. Now, he had two major things that totally changed his entire presidential time period. One was Hurricane Katrina and the War on Terror. Hurricane Katrina was so expensive, it devastated so much in the United States that it's actually more expensive. That event was more expensive to the United States than the War on Terror. That means the War on Terror, the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, that is dwarfed almost in comparison to Hurricane Katrina. That was a terrible event that happened. Now, President Barack Obama, he left office with $18 trillion in national debt. And the big crisis that he had that really plagued his entire presidency was the financial crisis and getting out of that. And all the stimulus packages that came into that and trying to rebuild the nation so we become more prosperous. So it's very good to understand what we spent money on and where we were and where we're going. And naturally, it's always better to be debt-free. And I hope that we one day will move to that directions. So, dear students, I recommend that you plan for the future, because you are the future. How do we deal with the national debt? How do we pay it off? Because you will be in charge of this upcoming, disaster. Here's an example of how economic sanctions work. So when it comes to a trade embargo, a bunch of countries go together and say, we're going to have a trade embargo on this nation because we don't like the way they are behaving. So what they do is that they enforce and limit the amounts of goods and services provided for that country, which makes any types of supplies more expensive and more scarce. So it indirectly pushes the availability to supply goods and services to the people in the nation. This is a demand of the people inside a country. Pushes this upwards. It forces a shift in the supply. And the whole idea is that you avoid any type of military or war or anything like that. The idea is to make it more expensive, and it should, if we're lucky, make the people in that country get upset with how the country is being governed, and the change will be completed from within. Now, naturally, if you have a country like Iran, where the central government is very strong and they have political forces that engage in some sort of political correctness and ways to behave, and they're willing to beat people up for it, the people might be too afraid to make a change. So it probably needs an additional bump besides making it, creating hardship for the people in that country. They need a spark to actually want to change their ways and change the way the country is governed. North Korea is naturally another example. Cuba is kind of interesting. They don't really pose a threat to the United States, but we still have an embargo on them since the 1960s. There's been some diplomatic conversations, and it's really tied down to that the assets that they confiscated in Cuba needs to be returned to its rightful owners in order for us to be willing to lift the embargoes and negotiate a future transition to a more normalized way of doing business, including how elections are conducted in. I believe it's a very important part to understand almost the Maslow's hierarchy of needs of a nation. And that means that typically we the people who have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's a really important part. That includes respecting the people, the citizens in a nation, in our nation, and how we conduct peace, what we believe that humanity means to us, and what freedom is. So a strong, independent, prosperous, and freedom-loving country is a very important part. And that influences how we govern, how we conduct fiscal policy, and it will make a sovereign, independent state allow its culture to flourish. And that's why we have rules and administrative code to help us coexist with each other. In the United States, the individual's right to self-govern is very important. It includes allowing us as a citizen to live the lives that we would like to have and not have rules regulating us from a federal way that prevents us from living a prosperous lifestyle filled with joy and happiness. Typically, most of the struggles are when one group of people want to impose restrictions on another group of people. And that's why we have a very strong civil rights movement in the United States. A very touchy area will be the part of marriage. Traditionally, and from a biblical point of view, it's in between a man and a woman. Now, the lesbian and gay community would argue that the traditional definition of marriage is infringing on their rights to pursue their view of happiness. They're asking to legalize marriage between man and man or woman and woman. Personally, I would say that the easiest way to solve that problem is to call it something else besides marriage. Say it a legal union, which has the same identical rights as the marriage between man and woman. I have no idea why the United States have not done anything like that yet, but I do know that Sweden was the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage, and they simply called it union. That way they didn't offend the religious side of things, and they didn't offend the rights of the gay community to pursue their way of life and pursuit of happiness. Just to take it one step further, to kind of simplify this whole thing, we have the right to start a business with whoever we want. Indirectly, two people can join together and start a business and then draft the legal rights that they have in between each other. It's almost like a marriage, but in this case, they will call it a shareholder agreement. Now, from a legal standpoint, we don't have an issue with that. But when same-sex unions or marriage, depending on who you want to quote from a legal point of view, would not be legal. Kind of interesting and curious. So these are the moral dilemmas that a nation has to actually work through and figure out how to do. Now, I believe strongly that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a very important part of a macro point of view. Just weeks ago, life was great. We were very prosperous in the beginning of 2020. And then a small invisible threat came around. The coronavirus, COVID-19. And it went and it tipped over this whole pyramid, and it really attacked us on our basic parts, our physiological needs and safety needs. Okay? It was attacked from the bottom, which meant that everything else disappeared overnight. Our ability to achieve our full potential disappeared for a moment. The prestige and feeling of accomplishment was just like out of the window. And it felt like our belonging and love, the relationship between us and our friends, suddenly disappeared. And we were quarantined to keep us all safe, which means that we have to focus on this part right here. The safety needs, the physiological needs. We need to have that base covered, taken care of. And that's why the federal government decided to put in a $2 trillion stimulus package to make us whole right here, so that we can have a prosperous way of life again, so that our right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can once again rise out of the ashes of this disaster. Now, naturally, when we have a disaster like the coronavirus, we should have another conversation about an Affordable Health Care Act. I don't know why we're not having it. Maybe that's not top of mind. Right now, top of mind is making sure the hospitals have all the supplies that they need. Now the question is, how shall we pay for it all? Someone has to pay for it. And if some people don't have insurance, who's going to pay for the ones that don't have insurance? Is it going to be the ones that have insurance? They're going to just pay more? So the conversation needs to go back. And when it comes to the Affordable Health Care Act, the real brain power behind it was Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. Brilliant guy. You can click on this web link and see the whole video that he's talking about when it comes to how to make it affordable. So just look up Friday, November 20th, 2015. Live on CNBC, 7:10 a.m. to 7:20 a.m. So a short period of time that he mentions the most important part when it comes to the Affordable Health Care Act. And what he mentioned is that we need an efficient insurance exchange. We need to force people to buy insurance with help of penalties. We need cost control. It determines the total success of universal health care. We need to manage the risk pool. Now, that's an interesting part. If we should have insurance for everyone, wouldn't the risk pool be everyone? And that means that we should not manage the risk pool? But it's an interesting clue that he puts out there. He also mentions some of the issues with insurance is that the turnover of insured people is about 30%. And that friction, that cyclical part, puts a stress on the cost of insurance. High deductible plans are part of the problem from his point of view. Now, new insurance applicants often require expensive medication that represents a lot of the cost of insurance. Now, another thing that he was pushing is lower prices of drug cost. Overall, what Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel pointed out is some of the things that needs to be done, tweaked, and adjusted to make health care more affordable in the United States. President Trump has made things easier when it comes to drug expenses. He's made reforms here. Now, the natural turnover of people switching jobs, that's a very hard thing to change. Now, when it comes to cost control, well, one big issue is that it costs very much money to educate a nurse and a doctor, and they have to carry very expensive insurances so that they can cover any potential lawsuits in case they accidentally treat someone the wrong way. So when someone loses a loved one, they get upset. They want to sue someone. They need to make sure that someone gets to pay for it. And that will be the doctor. So an alternative would be that the doctors would offer a simple solution where they would say, okay, if you promise not to sue me for mistreating you somehow, and it would never be in the doctor's best interest to harm you, we just have to assume that, then we can agree that if I get to pay less for this surgery, significantly less, I will waive my opportunity to ask for reparations to make myself whole or my family whole in case something goes wrong. That would significantly cut the cost of health care. When it comes to efficient insurance exchanges, why not just allow insurance companies to actually sell insurance across the borders of state lines? Make it simple. So all these things, there's lots of different ways of solving it, and we can do it one step at a time, but it's something that we have to deal with because it costs us a lot of money. Now, I don't like the word Obamacare because it was really Nancy Pelosi that came up with the whole idea, so it's better to use the Affordable Health Care Act. Now, it was pretty much drafted and led by Nancy Pelosi and built by Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel. Brilliant guy. I might not agree with everything he has to say, but I must say that he understood all the ins and outs of how insurance works. So, one way of solving is that we will have what Congress has. And that was truly a Cadillac insurance plan. And last time I checked, a Cadillac is not a Ford Taurus or a, Ford Focus, an inexpensive vehicle. A Cadillac is a fairly expensive vehicle, which means that if we're going to have a souped up, fat insurance policy, that will cost a bunch of money. Okay? that costs money. Because it costs more, that means that the demand will decrease. So sometimes they have to look at what is available and what should be offered. If people need additional bells and whistles, just allow people to buy additional insurance. That should be okay. Another part is that don't force people to buy stuff that they don't need. Why should women pay for a prostate check? That's just weird. And why should guys pay for a mammogram? That's strange too. So the question is, what do we actually need to buy? If our vision is perfectly fine, why should I have that as a part of my insurance package? So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all when it comes to insurance. But maybe if we pool all the risks, it would overall cut the expenses. So the question is, how do we solve it? Well, one way of solving it is that we will force people to buy insurance with help of penalties. Well, the penalties were sometimes less expensive than buying insurance. So the question is, the government controls insurance costs and taxes, and should we allow them, the government, decide what procedures should be covered? So when we manage the risk pool, what are we looking at? When and how should people receive care? So overall, when we look at the cost of insurance, we need to look at how do we control the cost of drugs, the cost of educating doctors and also paying them, paying nurses, the physicians, the costs that they have. So if we would just say that we're going to impose penalties and just make it more expensive to cover everything we believe, we the people, our elected officials, that will initially cut down the quantity demanded because it gets more expensive. But if we indirectly force everyone to buy it, then it will then push quantity up. It will force the demand to go up to a certain level. And that's part of the solution of solving how to deal with insurance. The question is then, what will actually be covered? And will we actually be happy about that? I don't know. There's a lot of people that are bickering about it, and I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. I believe that in the end of the day, no one system will work perfectly. Okay, students, I hope you learned something about fiscal policy. And most importantly, remember, you are the future. You need to decide how this future debt crisis that we're ending up with some several $1 trillion of debt needs to be paid off. You're the future. You decide. I want you to get engaged in the debate. Because in the end of the day, the problem that my generation and the generation before me created will become your problem. It's yours. You're welcome. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.